So the title of the talk, I decided to go with Stories Told and Retold, Building Community While Surfing the Intersection of Race, Culture, Religion, and Idealism. I contemplated going with decolonizing the West using critical race theory, but opted to go with this instead. All right, starting with the quote here from Mark Hyman. As a physician, this quote really speaks to me. A lot of my work, both as a physician and as an artist, really about attempting to build community. And I like the resonance of this. The power of community to create health is far greater than any physician, clinic, or hospital. It's all about getting out and doing things together. But in the Dene way, I'm going to introduce myself to you through, my parents. This is my mother, Dorothy Connor Thomas. She was a school teacher in the Raleigh, North Carolina public school system for 39 years, originally from Gastonia, North Carolina. My father, James Edward Thomas Sr., originally from Wilmington, North Carolina, went on to become one of the first 13 commissioned officers in the Navy in World War II, known as the Golden 13, then became a physician. My mom's mom, Rosebud Connor, she was known to me as Granny. She was my best friend as a child. And I have one child whose name is Jamal. He's biracial. His mom is, and the woman in the middle there is my father's mother, Florence Williams, down at the North Carolina coast near Wilmington, which again is where my dad was from. So I came to this area in 1987. I went to medical school, Meharry Medical College and HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee. And I had a 4-year scholarship from the government called the National Health Service Corps, the same program that gave us the Great Society from the Kennedy Johnson administration. They gave us the Peace Corps and VISTA, also gave us the National Health Service Corps, such that I knew when I finished my training, because the government paid for my education, that I didn't have to pay anything back monetarily, but I had to work in a health shortage area for 4 years. And that's how I came here. And I've been here since 1987. I finished my obligated time in 1991, but I fell in love with the community. And over time, I just have really enjoyed going out into the communities, spending time with people. And yeah, it's a two-way street. People over time have gotten to know me as well. There's an expression within the culture that unless you've been here for 2 years, people don't really take you into their trust. They wait to see if your actions are consistent with your words. And yes, I'm thankful for the many lessons that I've learned in my time here. One of the first things I did when I came was I built a black and white darkroom and really enjoyed going out. And I still enjoy going out into the community, spending time with people, hearing stories. And to the extent people are comfortable photo documenting what I'm allowed to see in the photograph with people's consent. So this is an older couple, two of the first people I met when I came in 87. Hustine Hank Nez and his wife, Thelma. Hank was a medicine person. They both since passed on. And what I'm sharing with you now is just some of my black and white photo documentary work from my early days on the Navajo Nation here. This next set of images comes from a 5-day trip I did with a family of 3, moving about 300 sheep and goats from the winter camp to the summer camp. This was back in 1995. It was a unique experience. When I first came, I heard that it used to be commonplace for people here to have 2 homes, a winter camp and a summer camp, and they would migrate animals between those 2 places, depending on the availability of food and water. I was also told that wealth was measured by the size of your animal herds. This is Lula, one of the women who took part in the migration. Lula was 45 at the time. Her mom, Minnie, was 72. Minnie and I walked the entire distance, which was about 40 miles maybe over the 5 days. But yeah, so it was lambing season. So this lamb and a kid were born. They couldn't walk. So Lula and her mom fashioned a harness to carry them. That's Minnie standing, Lula on horseback. The area where we did this is around Navajo Mountain, which actually is in southern Utah. So where I'm based on the Navajo Nation, I'm about 35 miles south of the border with Utah. So this region is really close to the Escalante, if that means anything to any of you all. Just curious, can you all hear me okay? Because I'm not getting any feedback, and it appears a very little screen, and it's hard to see. I don't see any heads nodding. Yeah, I guess that's great. If you fall asleep, I won't know. This is Minnie chasing her sheep and goats through Navajo Creek. All right, so we're going to transition a little bit because I mentioned that when I first came, I enjoyed going out into the community. I still enjoy that, photographing, documenting. And for 22 years consistently, I worked in my home dark room developing images. And occasionally I would have shows of this work in different galleries around the country. But I've always had a passion for street art. And after a trip to Brazil in 2009, I was there for 3 months. And the last 3 weeks of that trip were spent with a community of street artists who introduced me to the work of the French artist J.R. And for me, that was the missing link. This J.R. is someone who figured out how to take a photograph and blow it up to scale and use it as street art. And I came back and started experimenting with this and getting work up on structures along the roadside here on the Navajo Nation. But it's been an interesting journey because it's really, I think, deepened my relationship with the community, in that in order to get the images up, I have to go back, talk with people and share with them what I want to do. And in 2009, when I started doing this, there weren't a lot of murals on the nation. In fact, there were no photo murals on the Navajo Nation at that time. And there's a reluctance for people to show themselves in this way. But I think because of the relationship that I built with people over 22 years, they were willing to trust me and work with me and allow me to get some of this imagery up. Again, this is Minnie chasing her sheep and goats through Navajo Creek. This woman's name is Marie Madman. This young person is JC. I started photographing JC when she was 6 months old. She recently had a canal. Danny can tell you what that is. So JC is about 12 or 13 now. It's been really nice getting to be with them and watch JC become a young woman. I took care of JC's mom when she was pregnant with her. This is very close to the Grand Canyon. That's the Little Colorado River Gorge, which drains into the Grand Canyon. This is near the community of Cameron on the Navajo Nation. This is Rose Hurley with her great grandson, Xavier. I'm going to tell you a few vignettes. I'm going to share with you a few vignettes, stories from the Four Corners region. And this is the first of those vignettes. It's going to be a quick overview of uranium contamination on the Navajo Nation. And when I say it's an ongoing project, I started getting work up publicly about this around 2015, maybe earlier. And the reason interest to me, in fact, let me just ask, and Sunny, if you would not answer, that would be great. But if anyone else in the room knows why this issue might be of concern, feel free to share it.
Public health concerns.
Okay, that's, yeah. But yeah, okay, yeah, that's correct. But the reason it's a public health concern is because it goes back to the time of World War II. And this is where I need to look at my slides to see if I'm getting ahead of myself. But the United States originally said we weren't going to enter World War II. It wasn't until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor that we got involved in the war. But prior to that, we had told our allies in Europe that we would be an arsenal for democracy and make raw materials available to them for their weaponry. And one of those materials was uranium. This image references the early history of uranium. It was originally used as a dye in earthenware and also in glass. You could make glass of a greenish color that will glow in the dark. And when it was first being promoted, it was identified as something that was good for you. There was sparkling water with uranium in it. Does everyone there know the story of the radium or the radon? I forget the name of the movie. There was a made for Hollywood movie about this subject that came out a few years ago. But yeah, so because uranium glows in the dark, it was realized that it would be a benefit, say, to pilots during the war, flying night missions, being able to see the gauges in their cockpit if they were painted with uranium, and watch dials and all sorts of materials were painted with uranium. The unfortunate thing is a lot of the women who were painting the dials would do a lip dip paint where they would lick the paintbrush to get a fine point and then paint the dials after having dipped it in uranium. And over a period of less than 10 years, really horrendous cancers started forming in these dial painters. And there was a class action lawsuit that came from, I think, Pennsylvania in the mid-1920s. And I just shared this to say, this is a sarcoma on someone's knee who was exposed to uranium. The government and the industry knew early on that uranium was not a safe substance, but in order to create products and to make a profit, the safety concerns weren't necessarily foremost in the minds of industry. And I use this as the preface to say, during the 1940s, so uranium was discovered on Tindane-Bikaya in 1941. Mining started around 40, active mining started around 44. So it was really mainly during the Cold War that uranium came from the Navajo Nation. But at that time, the dangers of uranium were well known. How miners were not necessarily given safety materials, safety wear as they were working with the substance. This map shows where in the Four Corners regions the mines are located and tons of ore that came from each area, the number of mines. So the legend here real quickly is you have the state, the number of mines in that state, and then the tons of ore that were extracted roughly between 1944 to 84, corresponding to the period of the Cold War. So the Four Corners region, the Navajo Nation goes into 3 states, as you all know, goes into Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. It dips out here around Colorado. But this is the region of the country that had the most mines and produced the most ore. So presently, there's over 500 abandoned uranium mine sites on the Navajo Nation, and there are homes that are very close. In fact, there are communities that are very close to some of these contaminated uranium mines, as well as mill sites. So uranium was both being mined and milled on the Navajo Nation and elsewhere around the country. But what's happening, as was noted by someone earlier, it's become a public health risk because since these mines and mills aren't sealed, the radiation seeps into the groundwater, which then gets into vegetation. Animals drink the water and or eat the plants grown around that region, which ultimately contaminates humans as well. So around 2000 or so, the EPA, in order to educate children in schools in regions at risk of the dangers of uranium exposure, radiation exposure, create a coloring book called Gamma Goat, which was distributed. And these are images from the coloring book to educate student. Lower left, it says some of the largest uranium reserves in the world are located partially on the Navajo Nation. The first discovery of uranium on the Navajo Nation was near the Four Corners area in the Carrizo Mountains in 1941. So in order to bring more attention to this issue, I started doing installation, trying to, just make this more known, because of the 500 sites that are unsealed, they need to be sealed. There's grassroots activism around this issue. This is a small installation, and the issue became more personal for me when, as a physician, I started getting patients at the clinic where I work who were miners or mill workers. Mainly, I have a few patients who worked in the 50s, but most of them worked at mines or mills in the 60s. And they now have health problems that are related to their time in these mill sites, and they are receiving benefits from the Department of Labor, and they have to come in every 6 months to get examined. And so I just really love hearing their stories and what it was like working for them in the mines and mills. And they confirmed that there was no talk of health concerns about being exposed to the substance. This is Arthur Mannheimer, who passed away maybe 3 months ago. This photo is from like 2016. No, 2017. This is another one of my patients, Harvey Speck. I put this up around, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It identifies where he worked. The Moonlight Mine is actually one of the first mines that was used here on the Navajo Nation. It's found close to Monument Valley. So I said the mining started here around 44. Interestingly, it wasn't until March 9th, 1967, that there was any national mention of the dangers of the substance to the miners. And there's an article that appears down below the fold on the Washington Post: hidden casualties of atomic age emerge. This is how a sill site looks. I don't know how deep those walls of concrete are. But yeah, that's an example of a sill site. This is also near Cameron. 2017, I was invited to take part in a group show called Hope and Trauma on the Navajo Nation that looked at the legacy of uranium mining. And I didn't know what I was going to do, what imagery I'd be working with. And I had wanted an image of a uranium miner, ideally in a mine. And after a few months of searching, I was talking with a woman I've known. I knew her at that point for maybe 14 years. She works as the secretary for the medical staff. And she said, my dad was a miner who, worked here in the Four Corners area. And he died of a gastrointestinal cancer related to his time working as a miner. And she let me use this image of him, which I then had her hold. I photographed it, and to advertise the show, to promote it down in Phoenix. This is the poster that was created. But other installations, this is called the Green Room. This is out on the Navajo Nation actually it's just off the reservation. This is between Flagstaff and Gray Mountain on Highway 89, like you're going to Page or to southern Utah, to Zion, for example. But this was an abandoned building at an old trading post. I think it was used as the ice house. And what I did was I put sheep on the outside, and on the inside, there is corn, just a repeating image of corn. The purpose being just to talk about the insidious nature of exposure to the substance. You don't necessarily see it, you don't smell it, but unless you're walking around with the Geiger counter, it's there, making an impact on as I said, the groundwater, the vegetation, and animals and humans. That's the Green Room at dawn. I had a solar light that I stuck in there to illuminate it. This is a video I made playing with the concept of a portal. All right, High Country News. The date on that looks like 1985. Rand, an article on the cover. Down the back rows of the Navajo Nation, scientists are tracking an invisible killer, which may be responsible for the maiming of hundreds of Navajo children. See page 6. So in 2015, I think it was 2015, it may have been earlier, in conjunction with the CDC and the Navajo Department of Health and the Indian Health Service, the Navajo birth cohort study came about basically to look at the impact of heavy metal exposure on pregnant women and then to track their newborns over a period of 10 years. So I did an installation that spoke to that. Again, this is JC, who I said I started photographing when she was 6 months old. That's her sister, Gracie, on the right. If we go a little bit closer, you can see text around them. And the text basically is the story, the history of the Navajo birth cohort study, because Gracie is actually a participant in the Navajo birth cohort study. Her mom was exposed during her pregnancy, and JC and Gracie in front of their portraits. Yeah, so this next little bit talks about an unfortunate accident that occurred on the Navajo Nation 5 months after the nuclear reactor meltdown at 3 Mile Island on July 16th, 1979, earthen dam. So there was a mill in this community called Church Rock. Actually, it's like the Red Pond something, but it's in the area of Church Rock. And there was a mill there processing uranium, and the earthen dam holding the tailings broke and entered a nearby river, which contaminated, I forget how many miles the contamination spread, but it had a large impact on a significant portion of the Navajo Nation. And I had a chance to attend a commemoration on the 40th anniversary of the spill. This was from 2019. This is Larry King, who's a member of this community, Red Rock Pond and Church Rock. He was actually a mill worker and witnessed the breaching of this earthen dam. And thus far, he's remained relatively healthy. So I'm happy about that. 2012, so I started doing my street art project in 2009, going out, pasting images up and around the nation. And in 2012, I started inviting street artists from around the world to come out, spend time with people in community, hear stories, and then create work that was based on this engagement. So there would be some connection between these visiting artists and the community. And 2 artists they presently live in Brooklyn, but they're refugees from Iran named Icy and Sat. If you don't know their work, I suggest you check it out. It's really thoughtful work. The names again are Icy, I-C-Y, and Sat, S-O-T. But yeah, they altered this billboard on Highway 89 and headed towards Page. It was... Getting this up wasn't very easy, actually, because there's a Department of Public Safety, the highway patrol station, maybe, 2 miles from that billboard. And the billboard is at an abandoned trading post. In fact, the ice house where I put the green room is in back of the building here. And sure enough, the artist had just started painting the billboard yellow when a patrol car pulls up and asks what we're doing. He asked me if I own the trading post or own the billboard. And I said, no, we're doing an art project. And after talking with him a few minutes, he said, okay, I'm going to give you an hour, but I'm going to need some contact information from you in case there are complaints about this. So I gave him my card. You can see this, but this is my card and with my information on the back. And he looked at it and said, yeah, that's really nice, but I'm going to need your driver's license. But fortunately, everyone was okay with it. I never heard from the officer again. And on a positive note, a lot of these stories don't always have a positive note. In 2021, the EPA awarded $220 million for uranium mine cleanup on the Navajo Nation. Now, that headline is deceptive because it might give one the impression that they're going to clean up all the mines. But no, they're only going to clean up 10% of the mines with this 220 million. So it's a start. La Isla Memory Project. This story comes to you from the San Luis Valley. I don't know if you know what that is, but the San Luis Valley is in southern Colorado. It extends down to the northern part of New Mexico. It's the large valley in North America. It's roughly 130 miles long by about 30 miles wide, at an elevation of roughly 7,000 to 8,000 feet. So you're up at altitude, and this is really one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. I'm really thankful for my opportunities to get to work there. It was home to Utes, Apaches, the Mount Blanca, one of the four sacred mountains to the Diné, is within the San Luis Valley up by Fort Garland. But in the late 1500s, the Spanish settled in this valley. There were Mexicans there. And so that part of Colorado actually is the most Hispanic, And again, it's mainly a farming community. But what happened, the reason I got to go, I was invited to go hear stories and do a project in the community of La Isla. I clearly don't speak Spanish. That means the island, and it's a small area outside of Antonito in the San Luis Valley. But so during the time of the Depression, one of the biggest impacts of the Depression was on schools. A lot of counties lost the tax funding they had prior to the Depression. So a lot of schools closed, which left a lot of children at home across the country. And there was one party that was really concerned about the impact this was going to have on the future of the country if all of these children were not in school learning anything. So FDR, in the Great Society, one of his programs was to put one-room schoolhouses in a lot of counties across the country. In La Isla, this one was built in 1935 and it operated until 1969. It was made of adobe. And what I had an opportunity to do was to go into the community. And this is just how the building looked when I first saw it. It's a little tricky to see what's going on here, but the building doesn't have any doors or windows, which was awesome in the end. You can see that this is adobe. And can anyone tell what's happening with the floor here?
Is it a dirt floor?
Yes and no. Because the building doesn't have any doors and it gets hot there, and it's a farming community, cows would come in, especially during the winter, and just hang out in the shade. So that entire floor is covered in cow patties. I must say they were all dry, so it didn't have an odor. But yeah, that's the space. And you can see it's really fallen into disrepair. But I had an opportunity to go talk to people who attended the school and get them to share with me photographs of themselves or their family from the time they were at the school. This guy, Cletus, is still a friend. He became my intermediary with the community, introducing me to people, taking me around, and telling me amazing stories from that time. That's him on a horse. This is again from the period of the late 1950s. I think this is Cletus, his brother and his mom. And I asked him if he had any artifacts from that period. And he showed me this beautiful Brownie camera that was in his family at that time. And other family photos from that time. That's his mom, like a boss on horseback. I think this woman's name is Selena Gomez, but she's holding an image of herself from the time she attended the La Isla school. And that's her sister as an infant. No, I'm sorry. So this is I wish I could see the notes part of this presentation, but anyway, I forget this woman's name. I think Christina, I don't know. But this is her as an infant. And then I had an opportunity to meet with her as an old woman. And she too had photos from that period and brought some out and shared them with me. It's just an amazing thing to have an opportunity as someone from outside the community to come in and learn about a place through the residents of that community, and then to go back and read the history of that place. And it just becomes a real nice, rich, experience. So this is a small town, Antonito, maybe 3,000 people there, but they had an old resale store that had some artifacts from the period. And so these were soft drink bottles. I went in, photographed. And one of the people told me that when they went to the school, they remember they had a Flintstones lunchbox. So I'm a stickler for facts, for accuracy. I guess I'm a bit of a nerd in that way. But so in truth, like I said, the school closed in 1959. I just looked this up. The Flintstones didn't start until 1960. So in truth, but I just like that lunchbox. So boom, there it is. I photographed it. Get her name. It's in the notes. This is Cletus's brother, Walter, looking at a family photo. And I really like that image because, as you can see, he's backlit. And this print was made on a piece of printer paper, regular bond paper, like you would run through your desktop printer. So it allowed me to see what he was looking at. And I liked being able to photograph him reflecting on that time and those people, and to see who he was looking at. The only problem is the wall that I had to install this image on wasn't big enough to get all that detail. So this is what I ended up with. This is the work now on the school building in La Isla. Here's Cletus on horseback. There's Walter holding that image. Inside the building, I put a few photos of people who went to the school at that time. And so one of the things that fascinates me is printing on a translucent fabric. The first time I saw this was in 2015. I had an opportunity to go to the climate summit in Paris. And during the time there, I went into an art museum. And there was a show on the history of women in photography. And one of the images they showed was by a window. And it was a woman whose name I can't remember. And the thing that struck me was being able to see the image, but being able to see through the image. So when I started playing with this, what I didn't anticipate was the movement of this fabric and just how captivating that is. It literally activates a space. It's like the people, like the spirit of the people, is in that fabric and moving it. So let's see. Yeah, I spent a lot of time watching this fabric move. This is Cletus's sister, who's able to identify. She's looking at her mom in that photo. Her mom is a young woman being a boss on horseback. This is Cletus standing by his portrait. and his sister again. All right. Because I love the San Luis Valley, there's a fort there built in 1858, I think, during the time of westward expansion. And yeah, the fort is literally at the foot of one of the four sacred mountains of the Dene, Mount Blanca. And I don't know if Sunny has talked to you all about what went down in 1864 when Kit Carson force marched several thousand Dene people to an internment camp in southern New Mexico. But one of the commanders in this endeavor was Kit Carson. And Kit Carson was based at this fort in the San Luis Valley from 1866 to 1867. He was only there for 18 months. But like so many, by this point, there were mainly Mexican people and American settlers who had come into this valley. And this was in the 1860s. So I'm going to digress a moment. Does anyone know when the Civil War started?
What day?
No, what year?
1860.
1861. All right. What was happening is a lot of the soldiers who were stationed at Fort Garland were being called upon to return east to engage in the Civil War. So the Civil War went from 1861 to 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. So in 1865, the president was Andrew Johnson. And he was hearing reports that even though African slavery ended in 1865, he was hearing of native enslavement happening in the Southwest that was ongoing. And because the Congress had just passed the 13th Amendment, Johnson wanted to get an idea of the extent of this enslavement issue in the Southwest. So he asked they were called at the time Indian agents. They were the overseers of the land on which Native people were living. He asked his Indian agents to go out and do a survey per county of the number of enslaved people in each household. So the Indian agent, the agent in two counties in southern Colorado was a guy by the name of Lafayette Head. So Lafayette Head was from Missouri originally. His family was friends with Kit Carson's family, and they grew up in a rural farming community. And Lafayette Head's mom was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. And in her children and in her students, she emphasized penmanship. So when Lafayette Head got the assignment to do a survey, he went to all the homes and created this document. The first time I saw this document, a reproduction of it, was 2019. And the thing that struck me was just how beautifully written it is. And then I found myself in conflict with the feeling of, wait a minute, he's talking about list of Indian captives acquired by purchase and now in the service of the citizens of Conejos, I'm having trouble reading that, rendered by Lafayette Head, U.S. Indian agent for the Tabagouche, Utah tribe of Indians, July 1865. So between the two counties, Lafayette Head came up with roughly 140 people. Interestingly, when he turned this document in, he did not include the enslaved people in his house or the homes of his friends. He was really good friends with Kit Carson. In fact, he and Kit Carson were members of the same Masonic lodge there in southern Colorado. So what I was going to say about Kit Carson at Fort Garland was he was stationed there from 1866 to 1867 for 18 months. He was there with his wife, Josefa, and their son, Juan. Juan, it says here, okay, so this is Gabriel Whitson in the foreground. Juan Carson, enslaved Navajo youth of Kit Carson and his wife, Josefa, appears in back. Per Cynthia Becker and David Smith in The Life and Times of Lafayette Head, Kit Carson's wife, Josefa, traded the Utes a horse for a boy named Juan, who was going to be killed. Everyone agreed Juan was treated the same as her own children. Juan lived with the Carson family until he was grown and found a wife. So this is Juan in back. I presented him like a stereoscopic 3D image in the devices that were actually were popular in the late 1800s, where you drop an image into these glasses and you get a 3D image. Unfortunately, that effect didn't work there, but I like the presentation. So the thing that's interesting about Juan in this space, known as the commandant's quarters, is that this is where he was for those 18 months, 1866 to 1867. Fort Garland, as I said, was built in 58. And then from like the 30s until maybe 3 years ago, this building housed an exhibit on Kit Carson. They had like model figures of him sitting behind a desk, signing documents and celebrating him as a colonizing hero. The museum decided we would like to de-emphasize this settler colonial narrative and hear stories from people in the community, from in the valley. And this is largely a community of Mexican descent mixed with Native people. Very few, there may be individual families that are Native in this area, but no tribal communities are there. But people in the community were starting to do DNA swabbing, the online testing, and getting results back that indicated they were part Native. And they had grown up their entire lives not knowing this. And it's, wait a minute, let's have this conversation at Thanksgiving. What is this about? And many people were learning that there were enslaved Native people in their families. And so it's pretty profound to me that the museum was willing to transition from an emphasis on Kit Carson in every room, celebrated as a hero, to a counter narrative of what was also happening during that time that emphasizes, some of the local people. So what I did, I told you, I really love working on fabric. And you see there's a window here. And I don't know if this window had been open since the mid-19th or 20th century. It was really nailed and locked shut. But because I like the movement of this fabric, the museum conceded and opened windows so that there was the most subtle breeze coming into the room. And just the movement of this fabric is not as dramatic as you saw with La Isla. But so here is the head list once more, listing names of those. This is the name of the owner, resident, name of Indian, it says, tribe, age, when purchased, age when purchased, where purchased, male, female, married, single. I thought this column was really problematic to me for a while. I don't know if you all can see what it says. I'm going to assume you can't, but it says willingness to return to tribe. And then there's a lot of no's, one yes, more no's. So I talked to the museum director about this. It's like, why do you think that was? His comment was, we don't know the circumstances under which this question was asked. We don't know who was in the room when that question was asked. So it's a provocative, I think, part of that survey.
Chip, can I make a comment? This is very interesting to me because on my father's side, his four-time great-grandfather went to Fort Sumner, and while he was there, he told the fact that the Navajo women who had babies at Bosco Redondo Huerte, the children were taken after 3 months, and taken into slavery at Bosco Redondo.
Yeah.
And so it does not surprise me whatsoever, because that, and this goes back to the bluebird story, and I probably will cry. A lot of the Navajo that were enslaved went down the Rio Grande River Trail to Mexico. And they were just called bluebirds. That's how their relatives remembered them, because they just flew south, which was the migratory path of the bluebird. And that's why that story is so prevalent in my family. And my father's fathers, they all went by the name of Bluebird Man, Haskin Dole. And that's how the story of the bluebird has remained alive in my family. So I think if you swabbed a lot of people in Mexico, you would find a lot of native DNA, Navajo DNA, Diné DNA in them. So thank you, Chip, for once again for this.
Sunny, yeah, I love you. Thank you for that story. That was really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I had so many thoughts as you were talking. Oh, one of the things I want to point out is it occurred to me as Sunny was sharing that one of the ways that African slavery differed from Native enslavement in the Southwest was Native enslavement was never legal. There are no documents showing the exchange of humans other than baptismal records, unlike African slavery where everything was recorded. Native enslavement predates and postdates African enslavement. The emphasis in African enslavement, because the nature of the work was different. In African enslavement, the highest price was sold for males, young males who could work hard in the fields and who were bucks who could reproduce and make more enslaved people. Native enslavement, as Sunny was sharing, a higher price was paid for children and women because most of the work that they were doing was around the house, and they were domesticated and enslaved people who were treated more like family than ever happened in African enslavement. And women were also used in the sex trade at that point in time. And if you follow its trajectory, what's happening now with IW and Native women being abused and murdered, I think really has its roots in this period of enslavement. So I also had the museum open those windows, so there's some movement of that fabric, but super subtle. One of the amazing things that I had to do with this project is there's an architect named Ron Rael. His family is of Mexican descent, and they were some of the first settlers in the San Luis Valley. So he goes back 5 generations. And Ron is an architect who builds primarily in adobe, which is as a tradition from Mexico, from his ancestors. He's actually a professor of architecture at UC Berkeley. He's the artist who actually built the building, didn't necessarily come up with the design. With the concept, but he came up with the design with his wife for Prada Marfa. He's the person who did the teeter-totter at the border wall a few years back. But this is where he's from. And he's going around Southern Colorado identifying and attempting to purchase old adobe buildings so he can restore them and get them identified as historic sites in Colorado. So I said that, so the valley where Ron is, the community where Ron is from is where Lafayette had settled in 1853. Ron was able to identify Lafayette Head's house, which is made of adobe. And this building is on that property of Lafayette Head, who was the lieutenant governor, the first lieutenant governor of Colorado Territory, who was a trader in this community. The first flour mill in Colorado is just to the left of this building, which Lafayette Head ran. But this building is thought to be the home of the enslaved people in the Lafayette Head household. His wife was of Mexican, she was Mexican. And he said the enslaved people belonged to her because that was more of a tradition amongst Mexican people in that valley. But yeah, so Ron, let me take Lafayette Head's handwriting of this horrendous thing happening and paste it onto the building where the enslaved people live. Sorry. And this is inside that same structure. So just having a chance to interact with an historic space like that to reveal its history in hopefully an engaging way is just a really nice opportunity. And following the trajectory of Native enslavement, if we bring it forward, like I said, the 13th Amendment signed in 1865, enacted in 1865, really didn't have an impact on Native enslavement. And it wasn't until 1867 that the Anti-Peonage Act, I think it was called, or what was passed, that actually addressed Native people. But I think it was just Native people in New Mexico. So currently debt bondage, and the most common form of slave debt bondage, has been described by the UN as a form of modern day slavery. The practice is found in those places. And examples of it include this. And then, so this comes from a zine I made about the Native Enslavement Project at Fort Garland. And at the back of the zine, I included resources for people who are interested in learning more. All right. 9th and 10th Cavalries of the Buffalo Soldiers, an ongoing project. So at Fort Garland, there's this exhibition. I told you I love Fort Garland and really try to find ways to return. So after I completed the Native Enslavement Project, I approached the museum director and said, hey, would you, and asked if he would be willing to support me in a 2-year investigation of the Buffalo Soldiers, hearing more of those stories. Because like most people, when you say Buffalo Soldiers, they reference the Bob Marley song, and a lot of people don't know more than that. So but then it becomes an even more complex issue. It's like, how do you tell the story of people who were formerly enslaved, many of whom escaped slavery, fought for their freedom in the Civil War, after the Civil War, traveled west because they knew that work as a soldier, but also the independence relative to enslavement with a salary and constant meals and clothing. So those people traveled west, and I forget when the Buffalo Soldiers, they weren't called the Buffalo Soldiers, the government knew them as the US Colored Troops. And they were formed in like 1863 or so. Yeah, it was after the Civil War, 1865. But in 1875, the 9th and 10th Cavalries of the Buffalo Soldiers were stationed at Fort Garland, which is why they have this exhibition. How do you tell the story of these people who were previously enslaved, escaped, traveled west, and then were used as pawns by the government and their expansionist project against Native people? How do you tell that story, but how do you tell it in a sensitive way in Indian country, which is where Fort Garland is? At a space that's willing to decenter the traditional celebratory narrative of soldiers and the US Army and the cavalry. So that's the project I'm working on now. I'm still trying to figure out how to tell that story in a sensitive way. And I have to say, one of the books, and Sunny, I'm talking especially to you now, because as I said, I really respect you and your opinion and how you see things and share things. I'm reading a book now called Black Indians, and it looks at the history of Native people and Black people going back to the time of our arrival, actually prior to 1869, and how there were alliances, but there were differences fostered by the settlers, basically to divide and conquer. So the settlers could carry on with the expansionist project and enslaving people. But so there's this long history of working together, but then there were Native people who, I'm just learning this history. I feel bad for not knowing it, the 5 nations in the Southeast who actually had enslaved people, but how that was encouraged by the settlers. And then what happened to the freedmen, the people who were offspring of the Native and African people who were coming together, and how were they seen by the tribe they were from or the nation they were from. So yeah, this is some of what I'm wrestling with while learning stories about Buffalo Soldiers and considering what story I might tell. So the museum said, yeah, we'll give you money. We'll support you in this effort to tell an alternate history. They allowed me to bring in 7 other artists, including visual artists, poets, and writers, and a woman from Minkus who works in the letterpress. a letterpress that was founded in the late 1800s and is still active with some of the original printers. So we're all coming together, sharing resources, and thinking about how we might approach this storytelling in an alternate way. But one of the stories that I find incredibly compelling is this one. This image appeared, I first saw it maybe 3 years ago on Instagram with absolutely no context, just bam. And so my son, I said, is biracial. His mom is Navajo. So when I saw this, it's okay, what is that little Black girl doing with that family? And then maybe, I don't know, 2 years later, I saw the same image, but someone posted it as an example of Native enslavement and identified this little girl as an enslaved person.
I'm going to say no. She's not okay. An enslaved person because she's wearing the same regalia as the other 2 women in the photograph. And it says Ute. I'm not Ute, we did not practice slavery because of what happened at Fort Sumner. And she looks happy. She has very bright, clear eyes. She's looking directly at the camera. She's strong. She's not by any imaginations of being enslaved.
Those are all right on observations. Yeah, and you were right. So this guy is John Taylor. He was known as a Black white man because the binary in the West at that time was whites, Indians. So even other settlers from the US who were not white were identified as being white. There was also a recognition of Mexicans. I don't know if there were many Chinese in this area at this time. I think they were in San Francisco area. But anyway, so this is John Taylor. John Taylor was born in Kentucky in I'm going to say the late 1840s, maybe early 1850s, enslaved, escaped slavery in Missouri, became a soldier in the US colored troops, fought for his freedom in the Civil War, became a Buffalo Soldier, where he acted as a translator. He spoke many native languages, including Dene, I know he spoke Spanish. So he worked for the government as an interpreter during the settlement process with different tribes. Taylor, is someone going to say something?
No.
All right. I forgot what I was going to make a point about John. Oh, he spent time on the Kea and apparently has descendants here on a part of the Navajo Nation. But he really became known in southern Colorado in La Plata County, where it is said that the first non-native settler of where you are now, I think you're in Durango, is that correct?
Yeah.
All right. The first non-native person, this was originally primarily Ute land, but Dene, I should know all the tribes, Apache, Paiute, but the first non-native settler was John Taylor, who was also involved in some way in the creation of the town, development of the town, Ignacio, on the Ute reservation. He was accepted by the tribe. He married into the tribe with this woman is named Kitty Cloud. It is said at the time they were married, this was a few years after their marriage, but John was 54, she was 14. All right, so what's happening here? Oh, so if we go back to this image, this is Kitty as a teenager. This is her daughter, Euterpe. And this is her sister, I don't know her name, and her sister's daughter. So yeah, Sonny, you're very correct that, yeah, Euterpe was a part of that family. I'm pausing because just within the past 48 hours, a historian who's from Colorado, who interviewed Euterpe, I think in the 80s sent to me a photo that I'd never seen before of Euterpe and Kitty when Euterpe was maybe in her 30s and Kitty was maybe in her 80s. No, Euterpe was probably older in her 50s, but just to see them together as Euterpe is very dark, she's Black, and her mom is an older Native woman. But you can tell there's love between them. But yeah, so these are descendants of John Taylor. So this guy, the team of artists I mentioned to you, we all went to Fort Garland 2 weeks ago to hear from people involved in this story. And one of the people we met was Johnny Taylor Valdez, who is the grandson of Euterpe, the great-grandson of John Taylor. And he told, just amazing stories. This is the cemetery on the Ute Nation, Southern Ute Nation, Jack Taylor and his wife, Kitty Cloud. All right, I'm almost done. That actually went faster than I thought. What time is it? No, I guess we've taken some time. So people frequently ask me what impact this project is having on people on the nation, and I don't really have any metrics for determining that, but I tell the story of one of my patients saying that when he's driving down the reservation in their pickup truck and they see an image of sheep along the side of the road, his grandma gets a big smile on her face. So that's my metric for success, a happy grandma. And how I got that way, this particular piece means a lot to me. It brought something together for me. In 2001, when I'd been on the nation for 4 years, one of my patients, I'd taken care of the mom in her pregnancy. She gave birth to a little girl named Adrian. And when Adrian was about 18 months to 2 years, she had a seizure. And she'd been healthy up to that point. Mom brought her in. Excuse me a sec. And we examined Adrian. Adrian determined she had an infection, an acute infection. I think she had an ear infection, which caused her fever to spike. And when that happens in children, they can get a febrile seizure, which doesn't mean they're epileptic. So you treat the infection and children are usually fine. which is what we did. But the parents wanted something more. So they opted to get a traditional ceremony done called a sand painting. And so I said it happened in 2001, but it was actually in 91. This was years ago. And because since that time, prior to that time, I'd never been invited to the ceremony and haven't been since. So I'm so thankful I took the opportunity to have that experience. Because I got to the hogan, the traditional structure where this ceremony was happening, around 6 a.m. And there was a lantern. Now, I must have gotten there later because the sun was coming in through the opening in the hogan. But an older man was on his knees with a woman beside him. And in front of them was this beautiful, colorful, elaborate painting made of sand, different colors of sand. And I walked in, sat down, and because a ceremony was happening, I shook hands when I came in, but I didn't talk to people. So I didn't know what was going on and what to expect. So the hatatli, or medicine person, is working on the painting and completes it, at which time he starts singing. And the singing was a prayer. And in the culture, I'm sure Sunny has shared this, prayers are sung, they're not said. And the person who does the prayer is known as the singer, or the hatatli. So the hatatlis began singing, and that went on for maybe 5 minutes, and then told the parents to undress Adrian and leave her diaper on. And the hatatli had been singing to, looking at this painting he and his daughter, his assistant, had just completed. That was maybe 7 feet wide by 5 feet deep. And praying to the deities for good things. And Adrian was then placed in her diaper in the middle of the sand painting. The singing continued, and the medicine person had a bowl of herbs, which he got and had made for this blessing, and encouraged Adrian to drink it. I guess it was somewhat bitter because she was adamant that was not happening. And the medicine person continued singing and patted her down with this medicine. And as all this was happening, Adrian was aware that she was sitting in brightly colored sand or just colorful sand, and started playing with it with her hands and her legs and destroying what the medicine person and his daughter spent the night creating. And then the singing concluded, and the parents were told to take Adrian off the painting and she could get dressed. And then the medicine person and his daughter started collecting the sand into respective color little piles to put away. And I spoke some with the parents, but I didn't know what I had experienced. And I don't know what I thought was going to happen to the painting. There's just, and so they had spent the night investing time, energy, love, and good thinking into this piece for the purpose of healing Adrian. And then it was done. They just let it go. So that's what informs my art practice in terms of the imagery that I create and put along the roadside. It's a conversation with the people of the res, but it's done hopefully in a respectful way, in a good way, with love, and then I let it go. And there you have it. Right on. Yeah. Have a good rest of your time together.